My name is Jerry McLaughlin, president of Clean TV. It's my privilege today to introduce you to somebody by the name of Avi Lipkin, an expert, one of the foremost world experts on the Middle East. Now you might be thinking, I don't live in the Middle East. I live in Australia or New Zealand or maybe the United States. What's the Middle East got to do with me? I've got enough problems of my own. They're all crazy out there anyway. You ever see those guys in the news? Well, I used to kind of think that way as well. Until one day when I heard a man speak, Avi Lipkin. He showed me the connection between the Middle East and the United States and the Western world. There's a lot of things we don't really understand, and that's why he's brought to us today to simplify the very complex. Avi is a graduate of Hebrew University. At 19 years old, he left the United States to make his home in Israel. He's been a spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces. He was in the artillery reserves there for about 16 years. He wrote a book back in 1997 called Is Fanatic Islam a Global Threat? The world wasn't listening to him then, but they're certainly listening to him now. He warned the world that fanatic Muslims would come on the United States soil as terrorists, aiming airplanes at landmark buildings. He even mentioned in his lecture series the World Trade Center would be the source of another attack. Without further ado, the man who will tell us a lot of things that are likely to happen next in the Middle East, Avi Lipkin.
Shalom again. In our first program, we discussed the Islamic agenda, the revolutionary and evolutionary agendas for the Islamic takeover of the world. This new subject we're going to talk about in the second program deals with an entirely different subject. I'm going to talk about the creation of a Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy party to run for the Israeli government, the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli Congress. This party is called in English the Bible Bloc, Israel's Bible Bloc. It is a bloc of Jews and Christians who believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who believe in the Old Testament and believe that the Messiah is a Jew from Israel who speaks Hebrew. In Hebrew, the name of the party is Gush HaTanachi. Gush means block, and Tanakh is the Old Testament in Hebrew. Now, in Hebrew, we do not say the Bible, which includes New Testament, Old Testament. In Hebrew, the Tanakh is an abbreviation for the books of the Old Testament, and the New Testament is called the Brit HaChadashah. The party in Hebrew will be called the Old Testament Party, and the reason for that is because Jews and Christians agree on the Old Testament. Of course, Christians believe in the New Testament, Jews believe in the Talmud, and the idea of the party is commonality. What do Jews and Christians share? Not what divides us. What Jews and Christians share. And for example, what made America the greatest country on earth? And is it possible, perhaps, God willing, that Israel would be able to enjoy some of the fruits of this Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy? As I said in the first program, I said that I am an American-born Jew. I was born in America, raised in America the first 19 years of my life, and I moved to Israel 40 years ago. I've been in Israel 40 years. And I've also served in the Israeli military reserves and regular army in different capacities for over 30 years. 2 years I was senior editor and translator in the Prime Minister's office. I know about life in Israel. I understand Israeli politics, but I was also born in America. I know about life in America. I know about the great heritage of the founding fathers of the United States of America. The creation of the United States was based on Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy. Now, of course, again, the name of the party is the Old Testament Bible Bloc. And you might ask yourself, what does this have to do with Western civilization and democracy? And the fact is that Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy are not just the Old Testament. They do include the New Testament. They do include the Talmud. They do include Greek philosophy. They do include Roman republicanism. Even a great French philosopher by the name of Voltaire said hundreds of years ago, "I might not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend with my life your right to say it." These are all parts of the great American heritage, Western civilization, Western European heritage. And by the way, slavery was in the New Testament and the Old Testament. It was a fact of life. God never liked slavery. God wanted us to be free. Remember, we were slaves in the land of Egypt for 430 years. But it was only Abraham Lincoln in 1863, in his Emancipation Declaration, that freed the slaves. It was only Susan B. Anthony in the 1920s who gave women the vote. And most people don't understand. I didn't really talk about it in my first program that we taped. But most women in the United States, especially liberal women, don't understand the threat of Islam to their status as free and equal human beings to men. These are all part of the great steps that mankind has taken in the last 2,000, 3,000 years. Like I said, I've been living in Israel for 40 years. And I love Israel. Israel is now my home. It has been my home for 40 years. It has been the source of dreams and prayers for the Jewish people for thousands of years. It is literally a miracle that Jewish people who were exiled a number of times all over the world and were gathered up by God and brought home to Israel. Israel saw the last commonwealth of the Jewish people destroyed in 135 AD or CE by the Roman Empire. Israel saw successive occupations and invasions by foreign forces. It was the Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Turks, the British, the Arabs. The land was made desolate. The Turks, for example, had a law in their books that if you had fruit trees were not taxed. But trees that did not bear fruit, you had to pay tax on every non-fruit-bearing tree you had in your garden. And so what did people do? They chopped their trees down so they wouldn't have to pay taxes to the Turks. When you chop the trees down, when the rains come, there's nothing to hold the topsoil, and basically the Holy Land had its topsoil flushed from the mountaintops into the valleys, creating swamps, malarial swamps. The mountaintops became lunarscapes. The deserts of the south, the sand dunes, all of these together made Israel, the Holy Land, a very, very uninhabitable place. And it says so in the Bible. When the Jews are not home in Israel, the land will be barren. When the Jews come home, the land will blossom. Without going too much into the history of the European ideologies, in the late 1800s, we saw the rise of nationalisms in Europe. Every country developed a nationalism. We saw the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We saw the breakdown of the Turkish Empire. All of a sudden, a lot of little nations were created out of these massive empires that had existed for centuries. A lot of these nationalisms were anti-Semitic in nature, primarily because there were churches in Eastern Europe that were very anti-Semitic. I won't talk about the Protestant Reformation at this point. The Protestant Reformation, the Bible believer Christian way of thinking, was a relatively new idea in the 1600s, and these people blessed Israel. But the churches in Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews were concentrated, were really rather anti-Semitic, and there were terrible persecutions. There were pogroms. Pogroms were like riots in which Jews were killed and women were raped, homes were burned, synagogues were burned, and many times Jews were expelled from their towns and they had to flee to another place to live. And so we see towards the end of the 1800s the beginnings of the Zionist movement, in which people returned to Zion. Zion in English is Zion in Hebrew. It means the return to the land of Israel. And for those people who don't know, when Jewish people pray 3 times a day, they pray for the restoration of Jerusalem. They pray for the restoration of the Jewish people coming home. They pray for the restoration of the temple. There are a number of things we pray for, and of course the gathering up by God of all of the Jewish exiles all over the world and bringing them home. And this is one of the points I'm going to emphasize at the end of my message. In 1867, Mark Twain, the famous author Mark Twain, visited the Holy Land. He wrote a book called Innocents Abroad, which described his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And he found a land so barren and so desolate that he said, if this is the promised land, I sure don't want it promised to me. And Mark Twain even said that he walked for 2 whole days without encountering a single human being. And indeed, the land of Israel was full of sicknesses and poverty. People lived basically on charity that was brought in from the West. In the late 1800s, there was the creation of a socialist, communist, Marxist ideology, which basically said to the Jewish people that religion for the Jewish people has been a curse. It has kept the Jewish people in bondage. And in order for the Jewish people to have a better life, the religion had to be dropped, basically. And what we saw happening, indeed, was that many, many Jewish people were divided into 2. There were those Jewish people who became communists and socialists in Russia and in Eastern Europe, and even in the United States, believing that socialism and communism and Marxism were the great equalizers that would make Jews and Christians and all citizens equal. And of course, we all know that this was proven to be false. There were many, many Jewish people who believed in socialism and communism, but they realized that they had no future in Russia or in Poland or in any of these countries in Eastern Europe because the hatred of the Jew was so endemic that basically they had to leave. And so what we saw towards the turn of the 1800s into the 1900s, the turn into the 20th century, was at first a trickle and later a stream of ideological people who believed in communism, socialism, and Marxism. They took off their kippah, their head covering. They did not put on phylacteries. They did not pray. They did not keep the Sabbath. They did not keep the kosher laws. They did not go to synagogue. These people were atheists, but they were Jews by blood. And they started to return to the land of Israel. And it was these people who rolled up their sleeves, drained the swamps, the malarial swamps. Many of the people died of malaria and other sicknesses. Planted trees on the bare lunarscapes left by the Turks. By the way, it's interesting indeed that money was raised by Jewish people abroad to buy swamps. And the absentee landlords who lived in Damascus and Beirut were very happy to take the gold from the Jews and sell them swamps because they figured that the Jews would all die from malaria and eventually abandon the efforts at reclaiming the land. And then the land would revert to the absentee landlords. What happened was many Jews did die, but these socialists were very, very ideologically committed, and eventually the land of Israel was legally purchased and then reclaimed at the cost of the blood of the Jewish pioneers who came home from Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and of course from countries like Yemen and Afghanistan. Jews were coming home from all over the world. Something was happening. Maybe you can call it a messianic spirit, that the Messiah was not too far away, and it was time for the Jews to go home. And by the way, you were beginning to see very, very fanatic forms of Islam and Arab nationalism in the Islamic countries. And so indeed, Jews started to come home at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century from all over the world to the land of Israel. It has to be emphasized, there was virtually no industry in the land of Israel. Agriculture was just restarting all over again. There were some orchards. There were, of course, some Arabs and some Jews who had orchards. Some Christians had some orchards. But the land of Israel 100 years ago, or more than 100 years ago, we're talking about 150 years ago, was a complete mess, desolate, barren area, a God-forsaken place, until the Jews began to come home. When finally the agriculture was restarted, when the orchards were replanted, when the industries were created from scratch, All of these achievements, or almost all of these achievements, were achieved by people who worked with their bare hands with very few tools and very little money. These people were communists, socialists, and Marxists. There were, of course, also nationalists who came home from Europe. Don't forget, you have nationalist ideologies versus communist ideologies, and you had religious people coming home representing religious ideologies. I will fast forward to the year 1922. 1922 was a year in which Mussolini came to power in Italy. Now, of course, people today think of Mussolini at the end of the rope when he was hanged by the partisans. Mussolini was an ally of Hitler after 1936. But from 1922 until 1936, the fascist leader, who at the time was considered one of the most popular leaders in Europe, democratically elected, was approached by certain nationalist Jewish groups who are basically the forerunners of today of the Netanyahu Likud party. And Mussolini began to train Jewish sailors and Jewish soldiers in the Italian army to prepare them eventually for a war with Britain, because Britain in 1917, 1918 had received from the League of Nations, the United Nations of that time, the mandate of Palestine from the Turkish Empire, which had been broken up after World War I. And the Italians, who had their own ambitions in the Mediterranean, sought to develop their own Jewish militias or their own Jewish armies, which would run contrary to the interests of British Mandatory Palestine. In the 1920s, the world experienced some very, very terrible struggles in European capitals, in European cities, between fascists and between communists and socialists. There were brawls, people were killed, people were shot, people were tortured. And of course, with the rise of Adolf Hitler, we see another type of fascism, which is much worse. Nazism is much worse than the Italian fascism. And there was in Israel, how shall I say, a transporting of these European ideologies to the Holy Land. So that you had in Israel nationalist Jews who were identified with the Mussolini Italian movement. You had communist and socialist Jews who were associated with Russia, with Stalin. And then you had the Orthodox Jews who were associated with the respective Hasidic and Orthodox courts of rabbis in Europe. So Mussolini comes to power in 1922. 1923, we see a split in the Zionist movement in Israel. And the movement basically is taken over by the communist socialists of that time, who, like I said before, dominated the fledgling industries, dominated the economy. And people who were associated with the nationalist parties were considered persona non grata. And the religious basically tried to run a line in which they were acceptable to both sides, and usually the religious parties ended up aligned with the labor parties, which were the communist and socialist parties. As the Arab pressures grew on Britain in the 1920s and 1930s with what is known as the White Papers basically limited and blocked Jewish emigration from Europe to the Holy Land. It was the British who aligned themselves with the socialist and communist Jewish leadership and gave them what was known as certificates of immigration. These communists and socialists shared their certificates of immigration only with their own people. Nationalists and religious immigrants were not encouraged to move to Israel. When the Nazis came to power and the Holocaust began, by then there was a situation in which people could not leave Europe. They could not get visas to escape. And these people were killed in the Holocaust. Out of 7 million Jews who lived in Europe and were basically behind Nazi lines at the peak of the Nazi conquest of Europe, out of 7 million, 6 million were killed in the Holocaust. By the way, 7 million Christians also died in the Holocaust. By the way, it is very interesting that any human being who denies the veracity of the Holocaust of the Jews denies the veracity of the Holocaust to the Christians, who also died in the gas chambers, together with the Jews. By 1948, what we find in Israel is a country that is receiving its independence from the United Nations, legally. The country has 648,000 population, Jewish population, and pretty much the majority of the population could be considered socialist, communist. One of the first powers to recognize this new Jewish state of Israel was Joseph Stalin's Soviet Russia. The reason Russia, Soviet Union, was one of the first countries to recognize Israel in 1948 was because the Soviet Union believed that Israel would join the communist bloc. There were so many red flags. There was so much to show Israel as a socialist, communist country. The whole economy was based on socialism and communism. There was a saying in Hebrew, we used to say, well, not we, the socialists would say, Ima Rusia, Abba Stalin, which means Mother Russia and Father Stalin. And of course, the nationalist group, to which I belong, used to say, Ima Rusia, Abba Stalin, Halavai Shainu Yitumim, which means basically, Mother Russia, Father Stalin, God willing, we should be orphans. But the overwhelming feeling of the Soviets was that Ben-Gurion would join the Soviet bloc. Now, Ben-Gurion was a smart man. Of course, I had maybe certain ideological differences with him because I was a nationalist. I belonged to the other camp, the persona non grata camp. But Ben-Gurion understood that there were a few million Jews in Russia and in the Eastern Bloc, but there were at least 13 million Jews outside of Russia in the Western Bloc, in the capitalist bloc. And Ben-Gurion decided to declare Israel's neutrality in the Cold War with Russia, between Russia and America. When Ben-Gurion, David Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, declared neutrality, Stalin was so angry and so infuriated that Stalin decided to punish Israel by throwing Russia's support consistently behind the Arab and Islamic bloc against Israel. And indeed, we see a lot of Russian weaponries in the hands of the Egyptians in 1956, the Egyptians, the Syrians, in the 56 war, the 67 war, the attrition war of 68 to 70, the Yom Kippur War of 73. The Russians really wanted to have vengeance on the Jewish state of Israel because Israel did not join the Soviet bloc. 1948, like I said before, Israel receives its independence, and the population is 648,000 Jews. And within a period of 2 years, 2 million refugees, 2 million immigrants come home to Israel. Half of them were from Islamic countries. By the way, very few people ever talk about the fact that it is true that Palestinians did leave in 1948, but there was a population exchange, population transfer. And actually, Israel received more Jewish refugees than there were Palestinian refugees that left. But we took care of our people. And by the way, my wife is among those people who were expelled from Egypt, expelled from Islamic countries, penniless. And my father-in-law served 2 years in Egyptian jail because all the Jewish men were thrown in jail for 2 years and tortured. But praise God, they came out alive from Egypt. They came as penniless refugees to Israel. And today, my wife and her 6 siblings all have homes, have cars, have jobs, and they have become an integral part of the people of Israel. But getting back to the overall history, from a population of 648,000, the majority of which you could say was socialist, all of a sudden, now you have an immigration of 1 million Jews from Islamic lands that were not socialist, were not communist, knew nothing about these ideologies, and you had 1 million Jews who came from Europe, from the deportation camps. In other words, survivors of the concentration camps. And many of these people, indeed, were people who were not communists. They were people who were business people. They were middle class. They were religious. And all of a sudden, the population in Israel became more, how shall I say, non-communist, non-socialist. But if you wanted a job, you needed a little red booklet that showed that you were a member of the Communist Party or a Socialist Party. Otherwise, you could not get a job. By the way, my own personal testimony, I was born in New York, and at age 15, 16, I decided to join a youth movement called Beitar. Beitar is like a Boy Scout movement that belongs to the Likud party, to the Cherut party. Cherut is one of the founding factions of the Likud party. And a very dear friend and neighbor of my father's said, you know, if your son is a member of this youth movement, he will never get a job in Israel. The communists and the socialists will make sure to it that he will never be able to hold a job in Israel. And it was true. When I moved to Israel in August of 1968, I was so ideologically motivated by my nationalist right-wing Beitar youth movement that I got on the plane, on the El Al plane to Israel, wearing my youth movement uniform. And when I got off the plane, the people who processed me at the entry at the airport said, you know, you're a marked man now, meaning I will never get a job in Israel. Because Israel is a very ideological country. At least it was. The population of Israel basically had to be subservient to the red flag, to the socialists, and to the communists. The fact that Israel has always been seen as an ally of the United States is because the Russians gave Israel no choice. The Russians decided to be solidly behind the Arab cause because Israel would not join the Soviet bloc, and that pushed Israel, socialist Israel, into the lap of the U.S. government and the American people. Praise God. In spite of ourselves, we became part of the Western alliance with the years. 1973, we had a terrible war with Egypt. From 1970 to 73, we had an influx, a temporary influx of 250,000 Jews who were called refuseniks. These were people who were conscientious objectors to communism. These people made aliyah. They immigrated to Israel. And they were virulently anti-communist. They were virulently anti-socialist. They were virulently anti the red flag. And by the way, in May of 1970, I and a few other friends were arrested for climbing up onto the balcony of the Histadrut building, which is at the heart of the socialist movement in Israel. On May Day, the 1st of May, we tore down the red flags and burned them. And so we were arrested by the Israeli police, and the Israeli police didn't know what to do with us. And then finally they let us go and said, don't do it again. Don't let us catch you doing it. Don't do it again. But the fact is today that the Israeli people, especially after the victory of Netanyahu in the February 2009 elections, the people of Israel are growing increasingly anti-communist, anti-socialist. 1973, Israel went through the terrible war of Yom Kippur with Egypt and Syria. 1977, we find an earthquake taking place in Israeli politics. And for the first time ever in Israel's history, we see the rise of Menachem Begin, who was my ideological mentor, the leader of the Nationalist Party. And for the first time, the Likud came to power. It wasn't the Likud at the time in 1977. The Likud was only formed in 1983. It was at that time the Cherut party, which merged with the Liberal party. By the way, liberal meant liberal, laissez-faire economic policies of the late 1900s. It's not the same as liberals today, which means socialists. And what we see over a period of decades after 1977 is an increasing return to religion, Jewish religion, an increasing return to conservative and nationalist policies under the Likud. When the Labour Party did return to power a number of times, they promised nationalist campaign planks, and then they went ahead and did the opposite, meaning supporting socialist planks and planks in the campaign planks that would support a Palestinian state. Enter the Christians. 1989, the Soviet Union collapses. Until 1989, the Christian population in Israel basically meant Arab Christians. In other words, Christians who had been living in the land for 2,000 years since the times of Christ. The Christians the Arab-speaking Christians made up about 2% of the population. These Arab Christians were divided up against each other. You have Catholic, you have Greek Orthodox, and their votes, you need 2% would mean 2 members of Knesset if they voted as a bloc, but because they were divided against themselves, and they voted for the Communist Party, because communism made Christians and Muslims and Jews all equals. Communism basically negates religion. A lot of these Arab Christians voted for the Labour Party, because Labour Party was also an anti-Judaism party, anti-religious party. And so the votes were divided up into different parties, and so the Arab Christians never really got any representation as Arab Christians. But in 1989, 1990, Israel all of a sudden experienced a massive immigration of 1 million Jews and Christians from Russia, Ukraine, and Ethiopia. In other words, 700,000, 70%, were considered Jews by the halakha. Halakha is the Jewish rabbinical, Jewish rabbinical law that recognizes those people as Jews, but 300,000 people were considered as non-Jews. I would not say that they were all Christians. Some were 50-50, some were atheists. Remember, a lot of people came out of the Soviet Union were atheists. You had couples that were 25% or 50% or 75% Christian or Jewish. But to make a long story short, 300,000 of these people were not considered Jewish. And a lot of the churches, Russian Orthodox churches, which had been empty for 70 years during the Russian Communist Empire, all of a sudden these churches were now filling up with people who came from the Soviet Union. Ethiopian Jews came home with their Christian relatives. So today, the reality of Israel is that we have 8% of our population today, which is really Christian, 2% Arab Christian, 6%, we will call it immigrant Christian. Russians, Ukrainians, Ethiopians. And 6% of the population today is Jewish, married to these Christians or related by blood to the Christians. And so the party that I'm working to create has, in my opinion, a minimum constituency of 14%. 14% constituency in Israel means 15 to 16 members of Knesset out of 120. Now, it is important for the viewers of this program to understand that Israel does not use the American presidential democratic system. The Israelis use the European parliamentary system, which means that, for example, in the elections of 2009, we had 33 political parties contending in the elections, and 12 parties actually passed the threshold of 67,000 votes and got into the Knesset. The political party that I'm working to form has not yet been registered. The law in Israel requires a petition with at least 100 signatures of Israeli voters and $40,000. By February of 2009, at the time of the taping of this program, we have already paid our lawyer $5,000. We need another $35,000, $15,000 for the lawyer, $20,000 for the Knesset registration fee. When you form a party, you have to pay a Knesset registration fee, which is basically forever. And we need 100 signatures. I would say maybe 110 or 120, because if certain signatures get disqualified, you should still have at least 100 to have the party legalized by the Knesset. The next elections in Israel are hard to predict. Officially, elections are to be held every 4 years, so we're talking about 2013. But as anyone who knows about Israeli politics knows, very often elections do not happen after 4 years. They happen after 3, or after 2, or after 1. And so our political party did not participate in the 2009 elections, but we are very, very optimistic, and we're very confident that we will participate in the next elections. The ideology of the Judeo-Christian Bible Bloc Party will be the Old Testament. Yes, love the Lord thy God. Yes, love thy fellow as thyself, the two most important commandments. Yes, the 10 Commandments. Yes, we believe in the morality of the Bible, which means no homosexuality, no abortion, and living a godly life, a life that Jews and Christians both concur, a commonality of law and loving that Jews and Christians share. Since the population today is 8% Christian, theoretically the Christians should have 8 members of Knesset. But the fact of life today is that there are no Christians in the Israeli Knesset. Now, because I'm an American, raised in America, born in America, and because the Boston Tea Party is at the heart of the creation of this new country, America, the American Revolutionary War really started with the massacres of the British military, of the American people, and the Boston Tea Party. No taxation without representation. What we have today is we have population that came home to Israel, Christians from Russia, Ukraine, Ethiopia, and Western Christians, who serve in the Israeli army. They pay taxes, they vote, and yet they are not represented yet in our Knesset. And I feel, I've been speaking about this party now for 10 years, since 1998, more than 10 years. I've been working to sign people up for the last 4 years with my lawyer. This is like a notarized signature. It requires that the Israeli citizen appear with his ID card, and it's photocopied, and the petition is scrutinized by the Ministry of the Interior. I believe that this party will succeed in garnering 8 to 14 and maybe more percentage points, more members of Knesset. By the way, in the last 60 years, there are about 3 million Jews who left Israel. These people moved to Judeo-Christian, Western civilization, and democracy countries. These people come back to Israel, and a lot of Israelis are very fed up with the Israeli political process because we have a certain endemic corruption in our political system in Israel. By the way, Americans will say to me, yeah, we got a lot of corruption in American politics too, and in all politics, I suppose, you have horse trading and corruption. But the American system, I would say also the Canadian system, the Western European system, the Australian system, these systems are the most beneficial systems to the people of the world. And the fact is, you don't find people fleeing from America and other Western Christian countries to go live in Islamic countries. You don't find these people fleeing to live in communist countries, because Nazism, communism, and Islam are systems which are not beneficial to the people. So what you do find is you do find refugees from all over the world flocking to America because the American people are a good people and the American system is a good system. And as de Tocqueville once said, America will be the greatest country on earth because the American people are a good people and their pulpits are on fire for the Lord. And what I'm trying to do is to bring the benefits of a Judeo-Christian Western civilization ideology of the United States, of Canada, of England, of the Western countries to Israel. Now, Jewish people, of course, do not know this quote from Romans 9 to 11. Christians know it. That is that the Christians are grafted into the Jews, and that together we make up a tree. Well, on the negative side, I would say that Israel is the grafting in of a Russian Soviet socialist system, an elite system, into Islamic Ottoman Turkey, which is the Islamic and Middle Eastern roots of the land of Israel and the people of Israel. Today in Israel, there are 4 different types of political parties, primarily. You have Soviet, socialist, and left-wing labor parties and Meretz. You have Islamic parties. You have ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties. And then you have a number of secular parties. What we do not have is a Judeo-Christian Western civilization morality party. Not only that, a lot of the people in our political systems, you have to remember, 50% of our population came from Eastern Europe, from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and Romania, 50%. 50% of our population came from Islamic countries. There is no exposure to the Judeo-Christian Western civilization and democracy of the West. And I'll say another thing. I have been living in Israel 40 years. I was fired from the Prime Minister's office. I was not given tenure. I was supposed to get tenure at my job. I was one of the best translators the Prime Minister ever had, Prime Minister Shamir. When I was fired by socialists who said, "We know your political views." I went to study for the conservative movement's rabbinate at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Israel. One of the reasons I was not given the permission to become an ordained rabbi was, "We know your political views." In other words, the seminary was ultra-liberal, ultra-left, which means socialist. When Rabin was assassinated, and I talk about this in my books, I was acting rabbi in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I had nothing to do with the assassination, but some Israeli immigrants living in Pennsylvania who were actually Romanian immigrants to Israel, socialist communist people, denounced me because I was a right-winger and said to my military commanders that I was part of the group that killed Rabin, which was utter nonsense. I had nothing to do with it. And I, not only that, as rabbi of Williamsport, Pennsylvania in 1995 during the assassination of Rabin, and it's all documented in the local newspapers, I had a special prayer meeting memorial service for Yitzhak Rabin. And yet I was called by over the phone by the Israeli Army General Staff, and I was court-martialed for being part of the group that killed Rabin. There was a lynch atmosphere in Israel by the left-wing socialist elites that still control Israel today against the right-wingers. I was vindicated, but I never was promoted to captain. I was left only as lieutenant in the Army spokesman's office. And I did serve 30 years in Israel's Army Reserve, 16 as an artillery crewman and 14 years as an officer in the Army spokesman's office. I've paid my dues in Israel, and yet I can't make a living in Israel. I have spent the last 18 years, 19 years of my life leaving my wife and my children, and now my grandchildren, praise God, to come to America, Canada, and Europe and preach in Christian churches for 8 months of the year. Forgive the arrogance. I don't mean it to be arrogant, but I kind of identify with our patriarch Joseph, who was sold into slavery in Egypt and was basically 18 years away from the land of Israel, hated by his brothers. And then when his brothers finally came to Egypt because of the famine, and they were afraid he would kill them, he said this was God's purpose for good. This was God's purpose for life. And I believe that my presence in Christian churches, which allowed me to build a beautiful new home in Israel, which allowed me to pay my taxes honorably in the United States and in Israel, and to prepare for the creation of this Judeo-Christian party. The Christians of the United States, the Judeo-Christian ethic of the United States, is at the heart of my message. I think Israel must have a Judeo-Christian system. We cannot survive on what we have had for the last 100 years. Israel must go into a new dimension of politics. It must be a moral, biblical party, which will say to the Jew and the Christian, we are brothers and sisters. We believe in the same God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We believe in the same Old Testament. And by the way, if a person wants to believe in the Talmud, God bless him. If a person wants to believe in the New Testament, God bless him. That is the freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of speech. But the basic commonality of our ideology is the Old Testament for the Jew and the Christian. And of course, the Messiah is coming to Jerusalem, to the Mount of Olives, for all of humanity. But like we all agree, the Messiah is a Jew from Israel who speaks Hebrew. For the Christians, that's Jesus of Nazareth. And for the Jews, we will wait and see. In my first program, I spoke about the threat of Islam. The threat of Islam not only to the Jews and to Israel, the threat of Islam to the Christians, to America, to Europe, to the world, to the Hindus, the Buddhists, and by the way, the threat of Islam to the Muslims themselves, because Islam is a killing field system. Today, the political party that I'm working to form can gather, I believe, 14% of the vote, if not more, because I believe a lot of these 3 million Jews who left Israel in the last 60 years and have returned, very much like I have returned to Israel after serving 18 years in America, preaching in churches. I am now preparing for my return to the land of Israel, so I can be with my wife all the time, to be with my children all the time, to be with my grandkids all the time. It's not easy to be 8 months of the year away, being an itinerant, traveling preacher. I do 30,000 miles of driving a year. This is not something that I can continue for very long. So I'm preparing to go home to Israel. I want to share a testimony which will shock many of you. Because I am not a rabbi, a pastor, or a priest, because I am not a general in the Israeli army, because I am not a professor at a university, I have no title, because I am not a member of the Israeli Knesset yet, for the last 20 years, I have been working basically as a non-titled person, but somebody, as you can see, who speaks English as a mother tongue. I could not get, excuse the expression, gigs. I could not get churches in the Northeast, in the New York area. I was not famous enough. You know, Israeli speakers, generals, you know, top people, usually are invited in the big cities, Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., Miami, Los Angeles, Dallas. I basically, as a non-entity, had to buy a car, 5 years of installments, which I finished paying 5 years ago, and fly El Al to New York, get in my car at my dad's house in New York, and start driving. And here's an example. I don't know who's going to see this program, but my driving means usually 5-hour drive to Washington, D.C., 5-hour drive to Raleigh, North Carolina, 5-hour drive, 10-hour drive to Florida, then a drive to Texas, along the Mexican borders, along the Canadian borders. I've been in 46 of America's 48 continental states. I've been in 5 of Canada's provinces. I've been in 2 of Mexico's northern states. I preach in Spanish. I preach in English. I travel. I speak to people in synagogues and churches. I speak to law enforcement and military. And I'm constantly, because I can only get gigs along the Mexican border and the Canadian border, and actually now after 20 years I'm getting gigs everywhere on radio and TV that my agent and president of Clear TV, Gerald McLaughlin, is setting up for me. I am now, yes, a lecturer, author, journalist, and hopefully within a very short time will go into the history books as the founder of the Judeo-Christian Bible Bloc Party. The next stage, obviously, will be member of Knesset, God willing. And the next stage, if I do get in with 15 members of Knesset, is minister in Israel's government. And by the way, the idea will be, if I can garner votes from Christian voters in Israel who until now voted communist or voted Kadima or voted Labor, and shift these votes over to support a Netanyahu or Likud-type government, this will ensure that Israel will never again have to make the stupid mistakes that it has made in the past with the withdrawals that Israel has made, contrary to God's promises and God's words as to what the borders of Israel need to be in the Bible. And so one of my testimonies, and we are approaching conclusion of this message. Summer of 1999, I was driving on Interstate 5 from California up to Oregon, up to the state of Washington, then across the border to British Columbia, Canada, to Vancouver. And this testimony is called the Edmonton Revelation. The Edmonton Revelation basically talks about a planned genocide to be carried out by the Muslims against the Jews and against Christians who are associated or married to Jews. The Muslims' only complaint about Adolf Hitler is that he did not complete the job. The Muslims promise in their demonstrations that they will complete the job of annihilating every last Jew on the face of the earth. Don't forget, it says in the Hadith, and this is one of the most sacrosanct beliefs in Islam, that on the day of judgment there will be a final battle, and Muslims will kill every last Jew on the face of the earth. And there will be Jews who hide behind rocks and trees. And on that day, Allah will give mouths to the rocks and trees. And they will call out, O Muslim pursuers, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. There is no Muslim who will deny what I'm saying. You cannot be a Muslim and deny the veracity of this commandment to massacre the Jews. And when will it happen? On Judgment Day. When is Judgment Day? Today. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all agree that we are approaching a junction in history which is known as Judgment Day. By the way, the third program that we will do, the next program we will do, will be on Turkey and the Armageddon and Gog and Magog, which discusses one of the scenarios that could lead to this genocide, God forbid, Holocaust number 2. This time not by the Germans, not by the Nazis, but by the Muslims. I came to Vancouver, Canada, and I spoke 3 nights in a farmhouse. Each night I spoke 3.5 hours. In other words, I did a 10-hour teaching, and I never repeated myself. It was 10 hours. And by the way, I have a 10-hour DVD series, which is similar to what I did in Vancouver in the summer of 1999. I left on Wednesday morning. I spoke Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Wednesday, Thursday, 20-hour drive up the Canadian Rockies to Jasper, Canada, and then across to Edmonton. I spoke in a Baptist church 4 hours in Edmonton, Canada that night. The next day was Friday, and my Christian hostess arranged for me to go to the rabbi's house for the Sabbath. Don't forget, 6 days a week I'm with the Christians. On the Sabbath, I don't rest. On the Sabbath, I go to the Jews. I work even harder. And the first thing the rabbi says to me, Orthodox rabbi in Edmonton, says to me, what is a good Jewish boy like you doing in the Christian churches? And I said to him, listen, we're 5 million Jews in Israel. We are 13 million Jews globally. 13 million. The Muslims are 1.3 billion. In other words, the Muslims outnumber the Jews 100 to 1. And not only is it the Muslims have allies. The oil companies, the corporations, the banks, the media. Who loves the Jews? No one, except for maybe certain Christians. And those certain Christians are not our best friends. Those certain Christians are our only friends. And he said to me, I never thought of it like that. I said, if we had 100 or 200 million born-again Christians on our side, maybe that would help us to level the playing field. Maybe if we had a Christian Washington or a Christian Ottawa, that would level the playing field. And the rabbi said, you're right, son. God bless you. It's good that you go to the churches. I mean, I, as a rabbi, would never step into church. Most Orthodox rabbis don't want to step into church. The next morning, the rabbi introduces me, and he says, here we have Avi Lipkin. He is an Israeli army spokesman. The Christians give him 10 hours to speak. We Jews will give him 10 minutes this morning in synagogue. No sooner did I begin to speak, I got shouted down by liberals. You see, liberals are liberal with you if you're liberal like they. But if you're not liberal like they will not be very liberal with you. I was not allowed to speak. Finally, a Christian woman got up, and she said, listen, if you're not going to let Avi speak, this is a Christian woman who was attending the Jewish synagogue on the Sabbath. Why? Because Jesus went to synagogue on Shabbat. He didn't go to church. He went to synagogue. And Jesus kept the law, and he prayed in the synagogues, and he read from the Torah, and he read from the Haftorah, the prophets, and he preached. You want to know about the Jewish life 2,000 years ago, read the New Testament. And she said, you know what? Avi is right. Let me tell you a story. There's this Egyptian Muslim woman doctor, and she applied for a visa to live in Canada. And the Muslim terrorists in Egypt said, you're going to work for us. You're going to be our spy. And you're going to collect all the data on the Jews, their names, their addresses, their telephone numbers, and you're going to give it to us because we're going to kill all the Jews in Canada when a war breaks out in the Middle East. And if the Christians are married to the Jews, we're going to kill the Christian spouses too. And we're going to kill the children of the intermarriage of the Jew and the Christian. And any pastor who loves Israel, we're going to know who they are. And the Messianics and all the churches that are pro-Israel, we're going to kill everybody. When a war breaks out in the Middle East, a war will break out in the diasporas. And when this Egyptian Muslim woman doctor said, you know, I'm a doctor, I'm a Muslim woman, I go to the mosque, I pray every morning, but I don't believe in killing Jews and Christians. They took her best friend and slit her throat in front of her very eyes. The next day, this Egyptian Muslim woman doctor had political asylum in the Canadian embassy in Cairo. The Royal Canadian Air Force flew in a private jet to pick her up. And this Christian woman is in this Jewish synagogue on Shabbat, on Saturday, was the social worker taking care of this Egyptian Muslim woman doctor with 24-hour RCMP police protection. But the bottom line is, when a major war breaks out in the Middle East, there will be a homecoming to Israel of millions and millions of Jews and Christians who will be fleeing Muslim assassins. And that's because it's at the heart of the Islamic faith. I believe that the day will come that the Judeo-Christian Bible Bloc party, the Gush HaTanachi in Israel, will be a party not of 14% of the population. I believe that the population of Israel will grow from 7 million to 20 million. We're going to have 13 million immigrants coming to the land of Israel. Our borders will also grow accordingly, according to God's promises. So we're going to be a party that will represent all these new Western immigrants coming into a land where we never really had too much Western immigration. I believe the Messiah is coming to Israel very soon. Jews don't know. I don't know. Is it the first or second coming? Christians know. But the point is, Jews and Christians together are one people. We are the people of the book. We have the same God, same Bible, and the Messiah is a Jew from Israel who speaks Hebrew. And we will be dancing in the streets of Jerusalem, marching arm in arm, Jews and Christians, up to Mount of Olives. And we will ask the Messiah, excuse me, sir, is this your first visit to the Holy Land? Or, excuse me, sir, can we inspect your hands and feet? But the fact is, Jews and Christians will then know who the Messiah is. We will enter the Messianic times. We will have new borders, and we will have, I believe, a new political system which will lead us into the Messiah's kingdom. And God bless America, God bless Israel, and God bless all of humanity.